and specifically about neuroplasticity. So we're going to watch about a 2-hour podcast, a little bit longer than that. It's a Rich Roll podcast with our honor guest, Dr. Andrew Huberman, discussing on how you can hack your brain. I like the podcast because it's quite holistic. So there are a lot of, it's not just telling you how to hack your brain, it's also explaining to you how everything works internally and how it's influencing the outside world and how it's linked also to the outside world and how everything basically comes together. And then how do we get basically enabling to hack our behavior, which essentially means controlling yourself. You have absolute control over how you behave yourself towards certain events, traumas, but also how to control your behavior in terms of if you want to achieve certain goals, if you want to maybe start something that you've been procrastinating for a very long time. So I think it's extremely interesting podcast, and I've seen a few videos of Dr. Andrew Huberman. So Dr. Andrew Huberman is a neuroscientist, an American neuroscientist, which has also published a lot of books that I haven't read yet, but I definitely will do so because I'm a big fan of him. He also has access to his own lab where he does a lot of very interesting experiments and research, which he will also discuss a little bit more in detail in the podcast and also give us a very concrete example. But basically, he's kind of researching everything or experimenting on brain plasticity, neural regeneration, things like that. And one of the very interesting experiments, and I will just give you a very, very small window into what he will say. But basically, he's experimenting with fear and pain and kind of seeing how people react to that, because there's way of reacting to that. And there's pretty much one or two ways where I would say there's one real way to get through that, which he will explain later. But yes, I'm very excited. I'm going to be honest. I'm a little bit anxious because I'm very fascinated with psychology. And for this disclaimer, I am not an expert. I'm not an expert on psychology. I do have a lot of experience in kind of the real outside world where I'm a very I'm a person that will always look at social behavior if I'm outside. I am fascinated with how people behave in certain situations, and you start to notice certain patterns. And when you can understand those certain patterns, behavior becomes very, I would say, extremely easy to understand and to kind of anticipate how people will behave before they even behave. It's there's kind of a procognition, something like that. Is that the right word? Where you kind of know what a person will do before they do it. Let's just dive into the podcast, and I will break it into segments because there's a lot to cover. It's a little bit complicated, but I will not really, as I said, I am not an expert. So what I will do is just break into segments, kind of translate it in normie language, and also give my own experience. Because certain things that he discussed, I have experienced myself, and I can give you very concrete examples. So let's just dive into it.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. My guest today is Dr. Andrew Huberman. Andrew is a neuroscientist. He's a neurobiology professor at Stanford Medical School, a McKnight Foundation and Pew Foundation Fellow, and the founder of Huberman Lab, where he's involved in all kinds of really amazing breakthrough research on brain function, brain plasticity, and brain regeneration. His work has been published in top journals like Nature. He's been featured in publications like Time, Scientific American, the BBC, and he's here today to discuss the brain, to discuss growth, to navigate these stressful times, and many other subjects. It's an incredible conversation. I think you guys are going to enjoy it. I appreciate you watching. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, and without further ado, This is me and Dr. Andrew Huberman. First of all, thanks for doing this. I appreciate you coming out.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Long time coming. I'm glad we're doing it in person and not remotely. And I think what I want to do is start with your origin story, because you're your path is very unlikely. Your path to becoming a scientist, and I think it actually also kind of contextualizes some of the things that I want to talk about with you today. So maybe start there.
Sure. So on the one hand, maybe I was fated to become a scientist. I guess the two things that are relevant there are, I always loved animals, and I've always been obsessed with animal behavior. Like, just could watch Cousteau shows growing up, underwater life or animals hunting, animals doing anything is just so fascinating to me, because I think even at a really young age, I've always just been intrigued in sort of what drives different animals to behave in the way they do, and how body form matches to, I don't know what it was, but brains and how that all works. So I've always been obsessed with animals. And then my dad's a scientist. So he's a physicist. It was really early in chaos theory. And so growing up in our home, we had scientists over for dinner, and graduate students would come over for barbecues and things like that.
Is he a Stanford professor?
He was at Stanford. He was mostly at Xerox PARC, which is kind of famous. If you read the Steve Jobs book, is for the development of the GUI interface, the graphic user interface, and sort of early days of the computer. So he had a lab there, and he had a lab in applied physics at Stanford, and something called symbolic systems, which is a Stanford degree in kind of ecology and computation, that kind of thing. So I grew up in this family where science was very prominent, and we had lots of discussions in our home that I would overhear and I didn't understand about physics. And we'd spend summers at the Aspen Center for Physics, which was like
good times.
Yeah. So, and we were, and to be clear, you hear the word Aspen, we were a middle-class family, but they have this Aspen Center for Physics. So the Feynman, Richard Feynman was there, Murray Gell-Mann, like all these luminaries of physics, Peter Kaus. And my dad was really good at telling me the stories about these guys, and then I'd always want to meet them. And it was mostly guys back then. There weren't many women in physics. So I was kind of immersed in science from a young age. But right about age 13, my parents split up, and he moved overseas. He moved to Denmark, and my mom was really struggling with the breakup, and I wasn't in contact with him anymore. So I had this really unusual childhood where, we didn't talk about sports, we talked about science. And I had this close relationship with science and the people around science. But then all of a sudden, the structure around family, instead of dinners together every night, it was just like me and my mom. And I was an adolescent, and I was hitting puberty. So, there was bound to be some shifts in my world landscape and internal landscape anyway. But basically what happened was I stopped really paying attention to school, and I got really heavily into skateboarding and the kind of punk rock music. And I found my pack or my community through like a pack and community of kids that also just were kind of parentless. So this was like late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
And so at a pretty young age, I started I grew up in Palo Alto. I was actually born at Stanford Hospital. And started taking the 7F bus up to San Francisco and hanging around in Embarcadero. For the skateboarders out there, the listeners, this is the now famous EMB crowd. So this was the birth of a huge movement of skateboarders that became professionals. So you'd see the young Danny Way would come through town, or you had Rob Dyrdek, I remember when he came through. So all these names that eventually became popular during the kind of X Games era, but at that time it was really underground. And so it was this pack of maybe 100 guys, and it was run like a little city, and it was chaos. It was like there was fights, and there was drinking, and there was lawlessness. There was also a lot of amazing skateboarding.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of amazing people, and there were some older guys, like one in particular, a very famous skateboarder is this kid, Mike Carroll. His older brother was kind of like the older brother to everybody, kind of kept us all in check. So it had its own unique organization. And it's actually interesting because the same thing was happening at that time in Washington Square Park in New York and at Love Park in Philadelphia. There were all these like communities of kids that were basically parentless. And so in that time, I saw some interesting things. First of all, I learned what it was to be parentless. Growing up in Palo Alto, it was like soccer games and AYSO and, swim club. And all of a sudden I realized, I don't have to be home at any particular time, or, none of these kids are going to school. And so it was a kind of big group of truants. And it was interesting because it gave me a perspective that I had never had in Palo Alto. And I was drifting further and further away from any kind of academic rigor.
Right.
I think I would go to school every once in a while.
What's mom doing? Does she have any idea that you're going up to the city every day?
So she was totally checked out.
Wow.
I think she was just devastated by a bunch of things that were happening. And she lapsed into a pretty serious depression. Mm. And then in that community, what was interesting is I started seeing that, some guys were clearly fated to becoming professional skateboarders. They were really good at it. I just want to say, for full disclosure, I was not particularly good. I kept getting injured. I was not fated to be, exceptional or very good at it. But I love the camaraderie and I love the community. But I also noticed that, some people were drinking all day and other people got into hard drugs, and people started to, some of the dysfunction really started to show up.
Yeah, the fracture.
Yeah, the fracture
begins.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, and I started seeing that a lot more violence. People started getting their girlfriends pregnant. They didn't have money to support those kids. It started becoming apparent to me that there was a lot of dysfunction as well as a lot of incredible people in that community. And so, about that time, I got a girlfriend. And the other thing was I got removed from high school. So I went to kind of the famed / infamous high school in Palo Alto, Gunn High School.
Oh, you went to Gunn?
I went to Gunn, which is famous because it's one of the most academically rigorous schools in the country, maybe the planet. People move to the area just to send their kids there. But it also has this very complicated reputation as the high suicide rate of any school in the country. The New York Times has written about this. So, I would come to school every once in a while, but I could tell you far more about the curbs in the front of the Gunn High School parking lot than I could about anything that I learned at Gunn.
Yeah. So when they say you were removed, I mean, you were expelled.
No, basically they just said you need to either start coming to school or you're done. Uh-huh. So I got shifted to another high school, and that was the same story. It was a mess. It just fell apart. And so at one point, I was brought in, I have a kind of vague recollection of this, but I was brought in to have a discussion with a school counselor. And I don't think I've ever told this story before. And there was someone sitting in the corner. This guy was sitting in the corner, and he didn't introduce himself. And pretty soon I realized, I was like, I think they're going to take me away. Like I started to realize, because they realized my mom wasn't really able to control me, wasn't really in a place to support me. At that time. And that's what they did. They took me away. They took me to a place up the peninsula, which was not a jail, and it wasn't a hospital. It was just sort of a place where they put kids that were
like some kind of juvie warehousing situation.
Yeah, a lot of psychologists, a lot of locks on doors, a lot of kids that there were 12 of us in there at any one time. It was locked down. And the first night there, I remember I had a roommate who was like really into cutting on himself, that kind of thing. And he told me, he's like, look, if you just do what they say here, you'll be out of here in like a month. Uh-huh. And if you don't, you're going to be here a very long time. And I remember being pretty frightened for the first time. And at that point, I was like, oh my goodness, like, this is bad. This is bad. I'm a long way.
It's so hard for me to imagine,
I know. And
this given, who you are and what you do now.
I know. And it was literally like the kind of one phone call a day kind of thing. So actually I was skateboarding for a company in San Francisco. I think they put me on out of sympathy. And I called this guy up and I said, look, they locked me up. I don't know what to do. Can you help me? And I'll never forget. I don't want to say his name. He goes, "You're the most normal guy I know." He's like
the least likely of that crowd
exactly
for that to happen.
So in any event, I was permitted to go back to school eventually, provided that I went to therapy. And so I started going to weekly therapy, which in the early 90s was kind of a weird thing. You wouldn't admit it to your friends. But
yeah, I would say so that therapy was very much a taboo and a stigma in the 90s, even though I am from the 90s. I do know that. And I think now finally therapy has kind of become a common thing where just because you go into therapy doesn't mean you have extremely difficult traumas or mental issues to suppress. Now it has almost become a common thing where you are struggling with something, you can just go to therapy. It does not have to be always because you are dealing with, I don't know, depression or mental issues. I personally haven't been to therapy yet. Well, I've been like to one or two sessions, but it was not extremely official. It was with it was a friend that started doing therapy. It's interesting, and I think I want to kind of continue doing that because I am very very interested in introspection and basically growing and growing yourself and just keep moving forward. But yeah, that's true that in the 90s it was very much a stigma.
But so we'd skateboard around Stanford campus. I was doing my thing, and then twice a week I would go in and see this therapist. He's a remarkable guy because he had deep training in the mind, right? And we started talking about what was going on, and he really picked up on the fact that there was essentially no structure, no home life for me, but that I had a strong drive and I was really interested in learning. I mean, I was enthusiastic and motivated enough to, skateboard as hard as I could, even though I wasn't going to go anywhere with it. So at that point, and the fact that I had a girlfriend, I started looking for something that I could do. And I started, at one point I thought I'd join the fire service because it seemed like the camaraderie was good. At that point I started strengthening my body a bit because I didn't want to keep getting hurt. So I started running, I started lifting weights. A football coach at Gunn, actually, turned me on to fitness. It's actually an interesting guy. He wrote the script for that movie, Mr. Mom. Do you remember that movie?
Oh my God.
Yeah. Because his wife bet him that bizarre. He couldn't do what she could do, which was stay home with the kids. And he was this big, strong football coach. And so he made her a bet and he lost. And so he wrote that script. Michael Keaton played the, So he taught me, he was like, look, you can't even do a pull-up. You need to start doing your pull-ups. You need to start running, and he said the fire service might be good for you. So I was spinning out, but there were people that were willing to kind of, point me in the right direction. So what ended up happening was my high school girlfriend went off to college, and I didn't know what I was going to do. So I actually went and I lived in the parking lot outside her dormitory. I just wanted to be near her. She was my family at that point.
A college locally, or
she was at UC Santa Barbara.
Oh, so you drove down, and
I just drove down. Wow. I just camped out in the parking lot, and I was starting to get into some martial arts and Thai boxing then. So I think I was teaching some Thai boxing self-defense stuff on campus and doing this kind of thing. And by the end of that year, I realized that I should probably apply to college. So I applied to UCSB, and somehow I got in. Lord knows how I got in. I did, because I did eventually graduate high school, barely. Got in, and then after a year, I just completely flailed it. I wasn't going to class. I was getting into fights. A lot of that kind of mischief and kind of wildness was still in me. And what ended up happening was I got into a physical altercation on July 4th, 1994 with like a bunch of guys. And at the end of that, I walked back to the place I was staying. And of course, I wasn't paying rent because I had learned in those years, like, you can just squat in an empty house. So, it's Isla Vista, California, so I was really running wild and went back and I realized, I was like, this picture is really bad. At some point, this isn't going to be like a kid who had some problems. This is going to be truly.
It's not cute anymore.
It's not cute anymore.
No one's going to make excuses about your upbringing or the lack of parenting. It just becomes, you're going to end up being a ward of the state. I mean, it sounds like you were almost a feral animal.
Totally feral. Actually. And I have some close friends that's how they refer to me. They're
really?
Like, feral. And it's funny, even to this day, I mean, I'll get to where this eventually took me, but even to this day, when I go into a home where it's clearly like a loving home where there's kids are happy and there's good food and it's warm and cozy, I always feel this thing like, wow, like amazing. I sort of want to be adopted by them immediately. But I'm 45 years old, so that's not appropriate at this age.
What's so interesting, I keep thinking about David Epstein's book, Range. Did you read this book? Which is basically this thesis that some of the most successful people are not, we suspect that, the great talents of the world across all disciplines are the people who discover their passion at an early age and practice it voraciously for many, many, many years. But in fact, it's people more like yourself who've dabbled in all different kinds of things, who end up being ultimately, the most proficient at their selected skill set. And when I look at your experience, I see trauma, I see adventure, I see, all these obstacles that you've had to face and overcome and manage on your own, essentially, right? Mm-hmm. And all of those really inform perfectly the things that you're interested in and what you explore today in your lab.
Yeah, it really did. I think that I'm so grateful for those years. I wouldn't wish them on any kid, because I think having a secure, loving environment at home is so key. And, I should say about a third of the kids that I grew up with in that environment, that whole skateboarding punk rock culture, about a third have gone on to found companies or professional skateboarders. About a third just kind of drifted off, and about a third are dead or incarcerated. Yeah. A huge number. And so there's real value in having a support system, that's clear. But it exposed me to all these things like addiction, schizophrenia, rage, like all of these incredible elements. Like I was never really into drinking and drugs. I could drink or not drink. It just wasn't, I wasn't drawn to it. But other people, they took one sip and it was like, that was their thing. Right. It was like the magic elixir for them. And so, I was observing what was happening. And then after that, that July 4th, 94 incident I realized this is it. It's now or never. It really was one of those moments. You hear about those moments, but it was me realizing I'm living in this squat where I've got a pet ferret. My girlfriend's gone. She broke up with me. She was smart enough to break up with me. I'm getting in fights. I'm working at a bagel shop. I'm barely making ends meet. And at that point, I just made the decision. I just said, okay, look, I'm not going to be a professional athlete. I think I'm pretty good at memorizing things. I think I have an interest in people. I'm going to just decide. I just decided to do school. I decided that was the track. So like some people pick the military because it's like if you know what to expect, at least in terms of the passages that you're going to go through. And for me, that was school. And so I had decided to get back in school. I moved into a studio apartment by myself. I quit partying completely. I didn't go to parties. I got really serious about fitness. So I just started running and lifting weights. And I studied. You
went like Henry Rollins style.
I did. Yeah. I did.
That's a lot of self-awareness.
So there is kind of explaining his turning point, right? So he kind of was drifting to nowhere and I guess from a place of fear that really drove him forward and to becoming an expert in neuroscience. I have experienced the same thing. It seems that when you deal with something at an early age, I will give you a concrete example with me. So I would say from when I was 13 years old until about 19 years of age, I had social anxiety disorder, right? And it was social anxiety disorder coupled with a lack of self-confidence and a lack of believing in my intelligence. So I used to always underestimate myself and highly overestimate others. And because of the social anxiety disorder, I wasted 6 years of my time basically living in my own world, not really living as a human being. But I think that this experience was very important to me because I've been able now when I look back at it, it always has been a fear to never become social. So now I've kind of become the opposite, where I love being social. I would still consider myself an introvert because I have moments, and I think everyone has those moments where you have to just recharge your social battery. And actually, I always thought I was an introvert, that I didn't really need people. I was used to being by myself, being alone. I don't have siblings. But now I realize that this experience, and you can, that's the thing. It really depends, right? Some people do not learn from experiences. I think I did. And I think I really changed it around where I love being social with people. I love discussing things. I love making people happy. But that came from a place of fear of being antisocial my whole life. And I guess the other part where I was always underestimating myself or overestimating others, I think Apologies. I'm still dealing with my cold. Um, I think that's why I've always wanted to prove myself. That's why I've always been. I guess I am a very curious person. That's kind of natural to me, but I've always wanted to um, show what I can do. I've always felt like I need to show that I have a brain that I can do. So that's why I'm so interested in different things, and I'm always curious, and I want to learn, and I want to be able to have good conversations with people, showing that I'm knowledgeable, and that's because of my past. And I think everyone has these certain things that they dealt with in the past. Just going a little bit off track before we continue the podcast. So the thing with it's not very relate. It's not completely related, but I think it's an interesting take. So introvertness versus extrovertness, right? So as you know, you're on a spectrum, right? You're not completely introvert. You're not completely extrovert. The thing is, I think it is better, much better, to be introverted first, and then what I would call finding your extrovert energy, or being able to switch that around when you're in social situations, because introverts tend to always think more. They tend to do more introspection, while extroverts tend to just being more out there, and usually things come out of their mouth before they start processing it. And not always, right? I think extrovertness is also a lot about just having a bigger social energy reserve as well. But I think as an introvert you can become extrovert, so you can kind of switch it on and off. But as an extrovert, I don't think it is possible to become an introvert. I think introvertness is, to me, and of course I haven't done like really a lot of research, but that's kind of how I see it, how I feel, is that introvertness is kind of just like extrovertness. It's born, right? You Let's say you're born on a spectrum, but you will always lean to one or the other. So to me, that's very, very, very interesting. How, as an really like a real introvert, that I was extremely introverted, really extremely introverted. I had friends. I had no issues with making friends, but I could not talk to the opposite sex. I could not be in groups of people. I felt extremely uncomfortable. I felt uncomfortable in class. I think in fifth or sixth year, when I was 16, 17, that was probably the worst, where I was dreading to go to class because I felt so uncomfortable being around people, and also having sometimes to, talk out loud in class. I think a lot of children deal with that, where they don't really like that. But to me, it was presentations, one of the worst things. Just being in front of people, terrible. However, now I love doing presentations. I love having a public. I love, kind of interacting with the public, and it's also a very interesting dynamic. But I don't want to go too much into that. So let's just continue.
I mean, people go into the military because on some level, I mean, some people do because there's some yearning for having that structure imposed upon their lives. But you constructed that kind of structure for yourself.
Yeah, I think I was really afraid. I think I was like, and these days, because my lab studies fear, and I get into this whole thing around mindsets. People always ask me, like, is it better to do something from a place of love or fear? Like, it depends. And at that point, fear was the best motivator for me. And I just basically worked like crazy. And it's interesting because I didn't have a mentor or someone to bring me to that. But once I started doing that, there was one professor in particular who took note. He was like, oh, you seem really interested in this stuff. And I was like, yeah, because he was teaching me about depression, schizophrenia, neurochemicals. I thought I was totally turned on by the world of neuroscience. It wasn't even called neuroscience back then, but this one guy, Harry Carlisle, he was teaching me about thermal regulation and how the brain works and how receptors in the skin relate to perceptions in the mind. And he also had a deep sensitivity to mental disease. And I'd seen a lot of that. I'd seen a lot of depression and anxiety in my own family. I'd had a friend commit suicide. Another friend becomes schizophrenic. I think he's still walking the Mission District of San Francisco now. Seen some friends become addicts. And so here was someone explaining that there's actually an underlying basis for this. And I just poured myself into it.
Is that the same guy who would smoke underneath the vacuum hood and stuff like that, like a bit of an iconoclast?
Yeah, he was amazing. So he was a favorite teacher of many students, but if you could get into his lab, then you were kind of one of the chosen ones, I guess.
He's like the perfect mentor at the perfect time for you.
Yeah, so he used to drink coffee in lab, which you're not supposed to do. He used to smoke cigarettes in lab and in the fume hood, and they used to come and yell at him, and he would do it anyway. And I thought, this guy, he doesn't even know what it is, but he's punk rocker, he doesn't even know. And so, he gave me an opportunity to work in his lab, and at some point he told me, if you go to graduate school, they'll actually pay you to do science. And what ended up happening at that point was I hit a brick wall because I had a lot of resentment toward my dad. I felt, here's my dad, he was a scientist, he had, left us, all this kind of thing. And I realized if I didn't do this, if I didn't take this opportunity, it was gonna be the most foolish thing ever. What am I gonna do, spite my, my parents, because, I was 20 years old at that point. So I just made the decision, I'm gonna get a PhD, I'm gonna become a professor, I'm gonna get tenure, I'm gonna be like this guy, this guy who looked like he had a pretty good life to me. And so that's pretty much how I spent the last 25 years of my life is doing experiments.
It worked out.
It worked out. I mean, it was a lot of work. I mean, I didn't have the power of concentration. I hadn't read all the good books that gun high school students read growing up. I had to learn how to speak properly. I learned how to think properly, and really learn how to commit to something that was very linear and at times was very painful. And I went to some pretty extreme things. I actually used to set a timer and I wouldn't allow myself to get out of the chair until the timer went off.
Right.
So, and I would experience extreme agitation. But over time, I got pretty good. And now I can do long stints of work without any breaks. And it worked out.
You developed that neuroplasticity in your favor, ultimately. Yeah. You were always a reader, though, right?
I loved books. So I would, I would hide in the Tower Books section in the evenings, and I would read everything about fitness, psychology, anything I could. I've always devoured information. My favorite book when I was a kid was the Encyclopedia or the Guinness Book of World Records. So I would, when I was a little kid, I'd walk around the Aspen Center for Physics and I would tell anyone. I didn't even ask them if they wanted to hear about what's the world's smallest eutherian mammal. I would it could tell you all these facts that were kind of meaningless at the time, but I've always been fascinated by the inventory of different animals on the planet and their different behaviors. And so, voracious reader, and still now. Yeah, I love information.
Well, as a neuroscientist, I mean, you're your own patient. I mean, the fact that you were able to, turn your life around in such a dramatic fashion and do it essentially through sheer will and, setting up practices that would fuel you in that right direction, and then being available when those mentors showed up from the early therapist. Sounds like that guy almost saved your life.
He absolutely saved my life. Yeah. He gave me the book, Wherever You Go, There You Are, the John Kabat-Zinn book. And he said, no pressure, but if you can develop a mindfulness practice where you can sit still for 10 minutes a day, it'll serve you very well. So I started doing that. He could have told me to hang out of a window by my ankles. I would have done it. I think there was a self-preservation thing was kicking in for me. So I got very interested in mindfulness meditation. He also, it was, I think, quite smart in saying, look, there's a whole world of psychedelic drugs that are powerful in influencing the mind. He said, if you're going to explore those, wait until your brain has already developed, which I think is a controversial statement in and of itself. So he actively discouraged me to go down that path, which I think was the right thing, given I was a minor, And nowadays there's all this discussion now about psychedelics and their power, and I think they are very interesting compounds. But he really steered me towards behavioral practices. What could I do each day from waking up to going to sleep that would serve my mental health and my productivity well?
Right.
Yeah, I owe him a tremendous amount, and especially because he wasn't just in the psychoanalytic theory, he also was cognitive behavioral. He understood the power of practices, not just discussing issues.
Yeah, to begin a meditation practice at that age in the mid-90s, that's pretty radical.
Yeah, I felt it was funny because I thought if I didn't sit in the lotus position, like I wasn't doing it properly. You know, back then there was all this stuff around it. It was very mystical. And in my family, because my dad's very conservative and my mom's a little bit more of a free spirit, I was taught that anything that related to hippie culture was doomed to fail and cause problems, and that anything that was related to like conservative culture was fated to advance the progress of humanity.
Right.
And it turned out neither one was true, of course. But I needed people to push me in those directions. Lift weights, run, meditate, do your schoolwork, do your homework. And so I think now I have a good relationship with my parents, but I think I had to go out into the world and find those sort of paternal and maternal figures because they weren't in my home. I needed to find those.
Do you look back on your upbringing with gratitude? Like, how do you reflect on that experience and how it informs, how you think about what you do now?
Yeah, I'm immensely grateful for it because, where I'm at today is, my lab works on a number of issues related, sort of hardcore neurobiology of regenerating the brain, trying to fix basically cure blindness and repair visual systems, but also things related to, fear, courage, mindset, stress, anxiety, trauma, et cetera. And the early seed of seeing how science is done definitely gave me an advantage. I won't lie. Seeing how scientists interact and behave and understanding that they are just people, because a lot of what was discussed in my home was about the people, not just the science they do. That really gave me an advantage. And then seeing all that dysfunction and realizing that the human animal is amazing at making plans, at modifying its brain if it wants to. But the human brain and the human animal are also dreadfully bad at doing what's best for us.
Right.
Because of this, what I think it comes down to is the fact that our reward systems are not designed for things that are just good for us. They're designed for things that optimize the progression of our species, but they will grab onto and ratchet into any behavior that makes us feel good. And so the human brain is really not optimized for making best choices.
Right.
And so those years of seeing all that dysfunction.
I can testify to that.
Yeah, it's I wouldn't trade those years for anything. And I still have great friends in that community. I mean, I think had I joined a different community, I would have found the right people as well. Yeah. But to be with a huge pack of feral kids at that age and to see the function and dysfunction, and also it was wild. It was a lot of fun.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
That's a whole set of stories.
Did you see that movie mid-90s?
Mid-90s and the movie Kids, the Larry Clark movie. Right. When I saw that movie, first of all, I had a lot of friends that were in that movie because he used actual skateboarders.
In Kids?
Yeah. I actually knew a couple of those kids. And, it's a movie, but there were a lot of things about that movie that were very accurate.
Yeah.
And when I saw that movie, I was like, yeah, that's like pretty much a day in the life in Washington Square Park. And, it was a little extreme on some end, but you didn't know where you were going to end up each night. That was a unique experience, So, yeah, and mid-90s was really good. I think it captured the essence of what it is to be a kid that's just looking for some group of people to join. And skateboarding is a unique sport because you get young kids and grown men, and now women and girls do it as well. It didn't happen so much then, but now there are a lot of great, awesome skateboarders that are female, but they're all hanging out together. You wouldn't find that in soccer. You're not going to get little kids playing with grown men. Yeah. So you get exposed to a lot because everyone's at different developmental stages. But yeah, it was an amazing thing. I wouldn't change it for anything.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, let's segue into talking about the brain, and maybe we could start with how you think about the brain specifically. Like, what is the brain? What does it do? What does it not do? It helps us survive. It's our portal into trying to make sense of the world. Like, what's the starting point in the discussion around the brain?
Yeah. So the brain and nervous system. So it's like brain, spinal cord, connections with the body and back again. I don't distinguish between brain and mind. I think that's like an 80s discussion or earlier. And I think it would take us down the wrong track. So brain or mind to me is interchangeable. Mind-body is kind of interchangeable because the brain is connected to the body and the body's connected to the brain, right? If I pinprick my hand and it hurts, my brain registers it, where it happens. It's kind of an irrelevant discussion now. I think we really need to just appreciate that the nervous system is designed to orchestrate all the processes in the body, not just thinking and not just behavior. It really can be divided into 5 things. So there's sensation, and sensation is really bound or restricted by the receptors in the body. So receptors in the eye that perceive photons, light energy, receptors in the skin that perceive pressure, touch receptors, smell, taste, hearing, etc. And the interesting thing about sensation and the fact that the nervous system needs to pay attention to sensation is it's non-negotiable. The nervous system of humans is designed to extract physical phenomenon from the universe that are non-negotiable, photons of light. I can't see in the infrared with my eyes, and I can't see ultraviolet light with my eyes, and I can't perceive that because I don't have the receptors for it. So other animals can perceive some of those things, but that leads us to the next thing, which is perception, which is which sensations are you paying attention to? So all the time you're sensing things. Like right now, your feet are sensing the contact with your shoes, but you're not thinking about it until I say that. And then you shift your perception. Right. So perception is like this spotlight. So the brain wants to constantly bring in sensation. It's non-negotiable what's coming in. It's just dependent on your environment. Perception is negotiable. You can control that because I just said shoes and you thought about your feet and there you are. Then there are feelings, which can be a little bit nebulous, but feelings are a link between our emotion and it generally invokes the body, sensations in the body and concepts in the mind of what those sensations are about. That's really what emotions are. Animals definitely experience them. I'm kind of appalled to think that 10 years ago, people were like, do animals have emotions? Of course they have emotions, right? Because those are bodily sensations merged with some perception. So of course they do. And then there's thoughts. And thoughts are interesting because thoughts happen spontaneously. Think about like a web browser that's constantly giving you pop-ups. But thoughts can also be deliberate. So you and I can decide right now that we're going to think about a plan for something, or we're going to think about what's going on in the world. So thoughts happen spontaneously and they can be deliberate. And then the final thing is behaviors and actions. So the nervous system is responsible for sensation, perception, feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And what's interesting, you start to think about that as you're like, okay, that's a lot. But what is the nervous system really trying to accomplish?
So here we're seeing the nervous system, right? And the 5 different layers, which is said sensation. Sensation is basically the receptors in the body, right? So if I would pinch myself, that will be like a pain or skin receptor. So these are kind of information from the outside world that is continuously coming into the brain, and the brain is trying to make sense of that. That is what is sensation. Perception is basically the spotlight, right? That's how I like how he explained that. That's kind of nice. So basically, if let's say, and that's also interesting because sensation and perception can also be interlinked, right? So if let's say I'm eating something, so I'm probably enjoying it. So that's the perception is probably of the taste, right, of the food. But let's say that I'm eating something and suddenly I don't know, I suddenly hurt my leg. I hit my leg with something. Immediately, my perception will be on the leg because I will feel a sensation of the pain on my leg. So perception will immediately go to there. But we can deliberately kind of decide our perception, which is a very interesting in itself because to me, perception and perspective seem to kind of be a bit similar, where your perspective decides the way you see the world and the way you experience the world. Your perspective is, to me, an enormously important thing that you can actually learn how to control. You can actually learn how to control your perspective. It's not easy. It's not something like learning a language or something. It's not 1, 2, 3 step. You have to. It takes time, and but as he said, like as he discussed about neuroplasticity, we are extremely we can change. Humans are extremely good at change and at adapting to change. I don't want to stray far from that, but then thoughts are always spontaneous. So he says that it's like a pop-up browsers that are keep coming into your mind, and they are spontaneous, so you don't have really control of them. But at the same time, you can have deliberate thoughts, right? If I'm thinking now, it's hot outside, so I'm thinking about eating a really nice ice cream from a really good store in Prague called Creme de la Creme. Then I made a thought about it. So it's deliberate, spontaneous at the same time. Then you have feelings, right? And feelings is kind of the link between the emotions that you experience and how it invokes the body. So it's how to explain. So let's say you have sensations in the body and concepts in the mind. So if you have emotion, that's basically emotions, right? Sensations into the body. For example, fear. That is an emotion that I'm right now experiencing because there's a bear in front of me. Let's say there's a bear in front of me. I am sensation. My sensation is fear. So then you have a concept in the mind. That fear is going to lead to certain thoughts or concepts into the mind. So if I have fear, then I will be thinking, so how do I solve this problem of being in a state of fear? Do I run away from the bear? Do I just lay down and pretend to be dead? Maybe I will try to tackle it on, so it's very important to see how all of these, and I've only and deliberately only explained 4 of them. There's another one, 5th, which I will not go ahead. It's behaviors, but I will explain it after Dr. Andrew Huberman discussed it. So if we understand those 5, that's kind of really better understanding our body and how our body and our internal, wiring is also linked to the external environment and how these two communicate with each other. And that is a very important basis, because when you get to understand that, it will be easier to basically understand how neuroplasticity works and how we can introduce it in our lives and actually hack our behavior.
Like on any given day or at any moment, what's it trying to accomplish? And it's really trying to accomplish one thing, which is to take perceptions of the outside world and merge those with perceptions of the inside world, what we call interoception, and to link those in a way that's operating on our environment in the appropriate way. So what do I mean by that? So if I'm feeling anxious and I'm in a very calm environment, I'm going to perceive that rapid heart rate and kind of a feeling of agitation in my body as inappropriate for the moment, right? And my goal then as an organism is to adjust my level of what they call autonomic arousal or alertness down. If I'm at a great party, or I'm at a wedding, or it's a celebration, or I'm at a protest, or then I might feel that my level of alertness is appropriate for my environment. So the nervous system is in this constant dynamic interaction with the outside world and trying to figure that out. One way that this can be kind of conceptualized is there's an emerging idea that's kind of interesting about impatience. So we've all had the feeling of being impatient. Some people are far more patient than others. But if you've ever been in line at the store and you feel like something's going very slowly, the person in front of you is taking a long time, they're doing some returns, and you're getting kind of impatient, maybe you're breathing in a mask, and you're like, oh, like what's the idea is that if you're getting a certain frequency of pulses from your body, and if those pulses are coming in quickly, like you're perceiving yourself, that interoception quickly, it's like pulse, 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 pulse. You're going to be more geared towards your internal representation. And then you're seeing what's going on in the outside world, and it seems like it's going very slowly. But there are other times when you're in line at the store, someone's getting some returns and you're texting on your phone, or you've had a great day, you've had a great run, your family's in great shape, and you're fine. Why? Well, the frequency of those pulses, that interoception, is matched pretty well to your outside environment. And so impatience is really when your internal sort of metronome, tick, 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 is not matched well to the external environment. There are other times when you're feeling like your internal metronome is tick, 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 and you've got a million things coming at you through email or text, and you've got a bunch of things, and you're feeling overwhelmed and tired. Well, in either case, there's nothing right or wrong. It's just your body and your brain are trying to say, what's going on in the outside world and how well matched am I to it?
Right.
So if you think about some of the sort of core practices of mindfulness and self-regulation, of like focusing on breathing or focusing on state of mind, a lot of that is trying to bring more awareness to your internal state. But what our brain is normally doing when our eyes are open and we're interacting in the world is we're constantly trying to update our internal state to match external demands of the world. And this harkens back to a really early design of all nervous systems, which is how do you take an organism that needs certain things, food, water, mates, reproduction, shelter, how do you move that organism? How do you create a system that will do that in best relation to the environment? And so
I think it's very interesting what he was talking about, what impatience basically is, right? Impatience is basically when our internal metronome does not sync or match, right, with the outside world. To me, that is very interesting because if to be more patient, let's say, you have to have that certain, like, let's say, being in sync between your internal and your external environment. That means that to me, meditation is a very, very useful practice. So when COVID hit, which was in March 2020, that's about a bit more than 2 years. I actually, it was, I know a lot of people that were kind of depressed during COVID because everything was closed. Of course, you also had a virus that, that kind of instilled fear into us, right? Because it's kind of still new for this generation. We've never dealt with an epidemic before, and I mean, I'm saying just this generation, right? Because obviously we have, but to us, the modern world, it is kind of something new, right? And instead, I decided to kind of, since I didn't have any external, distractions, I decided to to start completely changing myself, revamping myself. And one of those things was meditation. So I've been meditating a little bit on and off. It's not always very regular, but I would say in the beginning I was very regular and very rigorous with my meditation. I'm getting back into that because meditation basically allows you to completely focus on your internal state or internal awareness. And if you can do that, it gives you certain control of your internal state, which means if you can regulate your internal state, and this is also usually a lot through breathing techniques and things like that, you will be better matched with your outside world. That's why meditation helps you to become more patient. And I have noticed this. I have become I can be very impatient, but meditation has allowed me to have certain tools to, like, breathe in, breathe out, focus on your breath, and then you become more patient. And that's why, to me, meditation should be mandatory in schools and in the education system. It is really such a powerful tool. It has had such a powerful impact on me. And meditation, as you will see further in the video, is also very linked to neuroplasticity and how to hack your behavior. It is one of the tools that will allow you to do that.
What Mother Nature has done is designed a series of systems. Let's just take agitation and stress for one. If an animal or a human is very thirsty, you feel kind of agitated, you might get up and get a drink of water. If you're very thirsty, it can put you into a state of panic. If you're extremely thirsty and water is a limited resource, you might even resort to violence to get it, or negotiation of some sort that you wouldn't if you were calmer. So that stress and agitation were designed to actually mobilize the body to take us in the direction of something that's adaptive. So you can start to see these kind of core elements of what the brain and nervous system do: sensation, perception, feeling, thought, and action. And this constant challenge of trying to match our internal state to the external real estate, the outside world. And you start to see that the sensations that we call stress or impatience or calm are really the result of those attempts that the nervous system is trying to perform.
That's a lot to take in and super interesting. And it it's prompting in me this, attempt to try to wrap my head around what within the brain is mutable, which is kind of, what your work is all about, versus what is immutable. Like you were talking about thoughts like pop-up windows on a browser. Sometimes our brains are just doing what they do, and that there are things that we can do, like mindfulness and breath work and the practices that you're talking about, hypnosis, which is another thing that you're, involved in, to help us manage better that process, to kind of take the reins and be more in charge rather than be prey or victim to these kind of things that just occur without our conscious awareness.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, in terms of value of understanding the nervous system and where it can be steered, it's absolutely clear that the nervous system can change in response to experience. So this thing we call neuroplasticity is really that. It's the brain's ability to modify itself in response to experience. And I think it's important to understand that from birth till about age 25, the brain is extremely malleable in a kind of almost passive way, where kids are exposed to things and the brain is just wiring up. I mean, the brain is really designed to adjust itself in order to be in concert with its surroundings and to optimize that, just the way we described it a minute ago.
Like the way that a child can learn a language very quickly,
or 3 languages.
Play the guitar or something like that.
Yeah, without an accent. Right. 3 languages without an accent. It's remarkable. You try and do that after age 25, it's very challenging. And so the brain is basically designed to be customized in the early part of life, and then to implement those algorithms and that circuitry for the rest of its life. And so the brain can change in adulthood, and it can change provided that there's an emphasis on some perceptual event. So in other words, if you want to change your brain as an adult, let's say you want to be less anxious, you want to learn a new language, you want to be more functional in some way, presumably. The key thing is to bring focus to some particular perception of something that's happening during the learning process. And the reason for that is that there's a neurochemical system involving acetylcholine. And it comes from these 2 little nuclei down in the base of the brain called nucleus basalis. All day long, you're doing things in a reflexive way. But when you do something and you think about it very intensely, acetylcholine is released from basalis at the precise neurons that were involved in that behavior, and it marks those for change during sleep or during deep rest later. So for people that want to change their brain, the power of focus is really the entry point. And the ability to access deep rest and sleep. Because most people don't realize this, but neuroplasticity is triggered by intense focus. But neuroplasticity occurs during deep sleep and rest. And we can talk about how to optimize those different brain functions. One of the things that's really important also to think about how the brain works in terms of plasticity and all this stuff is what the brain really wants to do is also pass as much of what it does off to reflexive behavior as possible. So, so when we're talking about focus, I think it can get a little bit vague.
I think this will be a pretty controversial take. Do with it what you want or not. For me, what has allowed me to build neuroplasticity, and this is me without having prior knowledge on how to do that. It kind of occurred with the right set of circumstances. Is drugs. So again, controversial state. So marijuana has, and I think it can have an effect on it has a different effect on everyone. Everyone is dealing with it differently because it alters your brain, right? It alters your brain state. It has effect on your your neurons, things like that. So what it allowed me to do was to be extremely focused on something without having too much control over that, right? So I didn't have a lot of control, but I was intensely focused on something, and then I also had access, like I said, to deep rest and deep sleep. So that's what he says, right? Neuroplasticity is triggered during intense focus. So during those moments where I was basically very high and I was intensely focused. So neuroplasticity was triggered. And then it occurs when I was having a deep rest. And it kind of created seeds into my mind that led to me taking certain steps that then lead to certain events. And gives you a certain outcome, right? And he will also talk about that, about RPOs, which is RPO. Sorry, let me see. Yeah, relation path outcome, which he will discuss further. It's very important to understand RPO because it will allow us to again get into easier into that neuroplasticity and to create the right set of circumstances. But and this is me talking out of experience. I have experience with that. I have never tried any other drug. I am afraid of that. I am afraid of psychedelics. I know there is a power behind it, but you also have to be in the right state of mind. And it also takes, why is it so scary? It takes the control of your brain from you, right? You do not have a lot of control. It's the same as being intoxicated, for example. But intoxication actually makes you take more risks because you do not care. It's not going to have a profound effect on learning from yourself. So to me also, what it allowed me to do is really understand myself, because then your filter of who you are kind of fades away and you become close to yourself and you understand better yourself. To me also, people tend to think that if you're on, for example, I'm going to be more specific here on marijuana, you will lose control, will not be able to do this and that. Like I said, I'm kind of losing a little bit control over my thoughts, but I'm so focused on everything I do, and I'm more focused on my surroundings. And this probably also has a lot to do with meditation. These two combined kind of how to explain this, kind of made me understand myself better, and kind of made I was able to be focused on something and being still in a right state of mind. Actually, I've had a lot of interactions with people when I was high, and they did not know. When I told them, they were like, "Yeah, no, you don't seem. You seem like normal." Well, I'm having a very different perspective and experience. But again, this is my experience. It is what it is. I'm not saying that I'm an advocate for drugs or for marijuana. I'm just giving you my experience, which was mostly positive. I've also suffered a lot, a lot of paranoia. I was also younger, so I believe that if you want to experiment with drugs, you should have certain maturity and you should have a certain age before you decide to take that, because otherwise you might have some real issues, especially if your brain is still growing and still developing.
But it might be useful to think about, like, what exactly is focus and what triggers plasticity. So the brain loves to be able to just do things, pick up coffee cups and drink and walk and talk and do things and not put much energy into it. When we decide to focus, what the brain really does is it switches on a set of circuits that involve the frontal cortex and nucleus basalis and some others, and it's trying to understand duration, how long something's going to last, path, what's going to happen, and outcome, what ultimately is going to happen. So duration, path, and outcome. The events of early 2020 are a good example of this. One of the reasons why it's so exhausting to be alive in 2020 is because we are now having to pay attention to duration, path, and outcome. How long is this thing going to last? When are they going to open up all businesses? Did I touch that door handle? Does it matter?
Right.
Who are the experts? Are there any experts? There are a lot of questions, whereas normally we can just move through life without having to do all that analysis. So if it's a simple example like trying to learn a new language or a new motor skill or a new way of conceptualizing something, maybe somebody's in a therapeutic process and they're trying to work through a trauma or something like that, duration, path, and outcome is built into the networks of the brain. We can do that very easily, but it takes work. And it almost has a feeling of underlying agitation and frustration. And that's because the circuits that turn on before acetylcholine are of the stress system. So when you or I decide we're going to learn something and really dig in, norepinephrine, which is adrenaline, is secreted in the brainstem and in the body, and it brings about a state of alertness. Then our attention, which is mostly a diffuse light, is brought to a particular duration, path, and outcome analysis. This would be thinking about what somebody is saying. What are they really trying to say? A hard passage of reading, a hard, set of math problems, a challenging physical workout. When you do that, these two systems have to work very hard, and the adult brain doesn't really want to change the algorithms it learned in childhood. But if you do those two things, you have alertness and focus. The acetylcholine and the norepinephrine converge to mark those synapses for change. And so the way to think about neuroplasticity, if one wants to change their brain, is bring about the most intense concentration you can to something, and then later bring about the least amount of concentration of that thing. So I'll talk about that in a second, but there were some studies that were done at Stanford by a guy named Eric Knudsen that showed that plasticity in the adult brain, any age, can be as robust as it is in childhood, as fast and as dramatic.
So that is extremely interesting. I did not know that. I know that after a certain age, it is much difficult, right, to have neuroplasticity. But what he's saying that basically, if you practice intense focus on the RPO, right, relation, pattern, outcome, you could build neuroplasticity and you could change your brain and learn as quickly as when you are in your childhood. That is, to me, insanely interesting, and it means that you have a certain power over your brain. You just need to find a way to access it, and the thing is, it's not just the press of a button. Our brains are very complex, very stubborn. You're right. Sometimes it seems that, and I guess that's why I wanted to make such a big change of myself. I sometimes felt like I lost control of myself. Not even lost control, like I never had control of myself. And the things that I've implemented really allow me to have almost autonomous control, like not over my thoughts per se. I know how my thoughts, let's say, flow and come into. It's when you do things, right? If I'm watching a Netflix show, I'm binge watching a Netflix show for 8 hours straight, let's say Stranger Things, then obviously you are going to have a lot of thoughts about that. And also when you're going to sleep, especially when you're trying to sleep, you might even not be able to sleep just thinking too much about that. You might even have dreams about it. So that's why it's important. Basically, thoughts can be somewhat, and I'm talking, sorry, I'm maybe not being clear. I'm talking about spontaneous thoughts, not deliberate thoughts. So spontaneous thoughts to me can be malleable and can be kind of directed and changed based on what on which kind of information you expose yourself on the daily. That to me, yeah, that's kind of it.
Wow. Provided the focus is there, and it's all contingent on this acetylcholine molecule coming from nucleus basalis. So you say, well, how do you do that? How do you get it? You know?
Exactly.
Well, I've got friends that chew Nicorette thinking that's going to get them there, because Nicorette is a nicotinic acetylcholine agonist, but that's going to globally increase acetylcholine. So I always tell them that's not the right approach. The right approach is to bring as much focus to a behavior or to a thought.
This is an extremely important explanation. It's important to pay attention to this one, because what he's going to explain now is going to allow you to have a certain access to infinite energy, right? I guess this may be also, sorry to interrupt here, but when I was younger, when I was a kid, let's say when I was from 6 till 11 till 12 years old, it almost felt like I had an infinite source of energy. I would just run around all the time. I was really fast. I was really fast at running, and I was really good at running fast for long periods of duration. And it seemed that I always had energy. Then when I was 13 and my hormones started to kind of losing control and going haywire, I began to build that social anxiety disorder and such. It seemed that I became very, very passive and very lazy. The only real things I would do is sleep after school. I mean, school is kind of tough, right? Especially 8 hours a day, and you have to sit and listen and concentrate. But I was a very lazy person for quite a long time. And now that I'm 31 years old, almost 32, I've never had as much access to energy as I have now. It seems that it's kind of a feeling of I can just keep going on. And that, I believe, is what's happening with what he's explaining on how to have infinite energy.
Or to an action pattern. And there has to be a sense of urgency. So what Knudsen lab showed, and another lab at UCSF, Mike Merzenich lab showed, is that if there's a serious contingency, like in order to get your ration of food each day, you have to learn this thing, the degree of plasticity is remarkable.
Right.
But if there isn't an incentive, it just isn't going to happen. So these circuits in the brain that Mother Nature set up are designed to be anchored to a real need. And people always say to me, well, should I do something out of love and a real desire to learn, or should it be out of fear? But either one works. The sense of urgency is just acetylcholine. It's norepinephrine. That's all it is. The brain doesn't have a recognition of whether or not something is pleasurable or not until later. Once you start accomplishing your goal, the reward systems like dopamine start kicking in. But I think if people are interested in modifying their brain for the better, at least some, top contour understanding of how urgency and focus must converge for that to happen can be useful, because I think there's a lot of attention paid to whether or not something feels like flow, or whether or not it's what I call highly desirable states, or whether or not you can eat a plant out of the ground that will magically put your brain into a state of plasticity. And the answer is yes, such plants exist, but what's missing is the focus component. If that work is not done with a particular end goal in mind, you'll get plasticity, but you'll get plasticity in a kind of across the board. It's like learning a little bit of 9 languages all at once is not going to make you speak coherently in any one of them. So focus is the key.
Right. I mean, this idea of flow is so much in the vernacular now. And, my sense is that people are trying to measure their level of engagement against some sort of theoretical idea of what it's like to be in that flow state. And if they're not experiencing it, they feel like they're doing it wrong, or they feel guilty, or they beat themselves up. And for me, a lot of it is just hard work. Like right now, I'm trying to finish this book. And I should have been working on this book for like the last 9 months, right? And I just couldn't get it together. Like, it's a collaborative project, so there's a lot of different people that are involved in this. And they've been working diligently, sort of daily, putting this thing together. And I've just been focusing on the podcast and been unable to immerse myself in this project, because I know from past book projects, when I go all in, like the addict in me kicks in, and it's like, it just becomes my universe. And I've been completely paralyzed from taking that on. And so I've dithered away most of the quarantine without being productive on this project. And then about 10 days ago, we had a meeting and we established this deadline at July 10th to turn this thing in. And it was like a switch got flicked and I went all in, and it's all I can think about now. And in fact, everything else feels like extraneous and a distraction. I just want to get back so I can focus on this thing. And 10 days ago, I couldn't get myself into that position. And it's made me think about like what is going on in my brain.
That is kind of basically what is procrastination, right? But depending, there it's important to know if there's a deadline or not. I've always been a chronic procrastinator, and I think a lot of people actually do, where I really wait until the last moment. But then I have had this where I had to kind of doing something like a project. It really depends. Sometimes I was very diligent, but usually I was quite a procrastinator. And I remember these times where I would start at 7 p.m. until literally 4 or 5 a.m. in the night, and I would have to finish this project. And you become in a certain hyper focused state, and that's just, like you said, that's kind of like a switch being flicked on, and that's being imposed by the deadline. And it is really amazing. That's why, if you want to be very effective at what you do and you want to put pressure on yourself, because there is something like good and positive pressure, the same as there's positive and also negative stress, is very important for us to to really feel that sense of urgency plus focus. Also, as I said, creates neuroplasticity. So if you're working on something, or you want to be more, you want to maybe that's kind of different. I'm not going to go to that later, but later we will also discuss on how to start something. I have procrastinated for about 6 years before I decided to start my own streaming, and eventually I want to move to podcasts as well. It's fear, plain and simple. Fear of, and again, this is where my childhood comes back into, where I really thought I was not good enough in terms of intelligence, knowledge. I was very afraid also to speak. I still have a little bit of this fear where I'm worried that I cannot express myself correctly, that people will not understand me. And something I'm working on, because I know it can always improve, it can always be better. But to me, it is very interesting that this is what kind of blocked me. And so it was my intelligence. It was also fear of not knowing how to set up everything. That's actually, when I think about it, the biggest struggle I had with my streaming. Now I've been streaming for about 3 weeks. It's also technology, because I am not very tech savvy, and I've had a lot of issues. But now that I think about it, the struggle that I had with setting up my stream to be kind of okay, kind of working, is very fun. That process to me has been a big learning curve, and I've learned a lot from it. And now that I'm kind of into this flow of streaming consistently, I absolutely adore it. And I am kind of similar uh, to Rich Roll, where I am a bit of an extreme. Either I would say, really not interested in something. I really don't care. I don't put any energy or time in it, or I am obsessed with it. I am absolutely obsessed, submerged into something. I feel like that's now has become my podcast. But I also have a lot of other interests. Um, the point I'm trying to make is, I'm not really making a point here, or I have lost the point. Let's just continue.
That, it's such a drastic state change. And what did I do to switch that? Well, a deadline was imposed upon me, and whatever happened neurochemically with that set in motion like a chain reaction of events that got me into the chair. And once I began the project, for me, it's all about like momentum, right? It's like getting to the starting line and beginning is so hard. Like I will just go forever without doing it. And then I'm in, and then I'm all in 110%. And I'm like, why can't I be that person who just worked on it, an hour and a half every day for the last 3 months?
Well, I can offer some potential explanations. I can relate.
And none of it involves a flow state.
Right.
It's all hard.
Yeah. And, I'm friends with Steven Kotler. I think flow, and I think the Csikszentmihalyi, who originated the thing of flow, is really interesting. But I say right now, the most we can say about flow mechanistically is backwards, it spells wolf. We don't really understand flow. Now, people have come up with these theories. It's like hyperfrontality. I haven't seen the data, and I'm not picking on anybody. I'm putting that out there as a prompt for people to discover this. I think that.
Apologies, guys. Just give me 2 minutes to go to the bathroom. I'll be right back. Hey guys, I'm back. So I will do two parts of this podcast. I was not very clear about this, but so I think we'll finish around in 15 minutes. Then we're at the half of the podcast, and tomorrow I will continue with part two. So just for you to know that I'm not going to stream until the end of the podcast, at least not today, tomorrow.
And to work on it. I think it's a really interesting, highly desirable state. But I think we need to get comfortable as a culture in trying to understand our species and how we work, that the early stages of hard work and focus are going to feel like agitation, stress, and confusion, because that's the norepinephrine and adrenaline system kicking in. None of us would expect to walk into the gym and do our PR lift, or a performer go do something without warming up. The brain also needs to warm up and start to hone in which circuits are going to be active. And it's unreasonable for us to think, oh, I've got an hour, I'm going to plop down and write beautifully for an hour, my best work. We need to accept that there's a period of agitation and stress that accompanies the dropping into these highly concentrated states. Now, in terms of the reward that accompanies the feeling that we're funneling into that groove of being productive in one regime, like for you writing this book, the dopamine system is really important to understand. So we've talked about norepinephrine kind of gets you going. Acetylcholine is the spotlight of attention. The dopamine system is Mother Nature's hardwired ancient system in all animals, including humans, to put us on the right path. Now, a lot of people talk about dopamine as this thing that you get when you publish the book, or when you get the book deal, or when something wonderful happens, like your child's born. And that's true. But dopamine's main role is to be released anytime you achieve a milestone or you think you're on the right path. And when the dopamine system is tethered to a particular pattern of focus, remember duration, path, and outcome. So it's like, okay, you sit down, maybe you don't get much text out, but then the next day you get 800 words of really solid text and you feel good. You're like, I'm into this. What does that dopamine system do? The dopamine system takes the norepinephrine, which is normally rate limiting. Like at some point, there's so much norepinephrine that you quit, and we can talk about that. It's actually the substrate for quitting. Dopamine can push that adrenaline back down, and give you more room, more space to do duration, path, and outcome work, highly focused work. And I'm making duration, path, outcome synonymous with highly focused work. Why would this happen? So let's think about an animal. Let's think about a deer that wakes up and is thirsty, and it's wandering out looking for water. That animal needs water. It doesn't know that it needs water. It experiences agitation, the same way that a baby feels agitation when it wants food, but it doesn't know it needs food. It just feels agitation and cries, and the caretaker comes, hopefully. That deer is now foraging for something that it needs. And let's say it smells water, because deer can actually do that, and arrives at a stream and takes a sip of water. There's dopamine release then that puts it on a path to maybe a larger lake or something of that sort, or to be able to go achieve food. So when we are on the right path and we hit a milestone, dopamine is released, and it tends to tighten our focus more for that activity. So
here what he's also going to allude to is dopamine is not like per se has to be achieving a huge milestone, or dopamine is not going to be released. For example, in my podcast where I will have 100,000 viewers. I'm just giving an example. That's not really. There might be some dopamine release, but that's more like also that's like an external reward, which is usually not what you want to be motivated by, but more like internal ones. And that's by actually having a release of dopamine every time you hit a milestone. And it can be very like small milestones. It can be a daily milestone, something like that. And that's going to allow you to kind of continue having put in place the gears, right? Like, so basically dopamine gets released and you continue getting focused on what you want to do. And then again, dopamine is going to be released because you're going to have, you're going to work on this, and then you're going to hit another milestone. And then that's kind of where you have that circle, and where you also kind of get into a state of flow.
So the dopamine, this is why drugs of abuse and why alcoholism and some process addictions, which are behavioral addictions, are so dangerous, because they a lot of those drugs of abuse are dopamine. So it becomes this cyclical loop where there's no other behavior that can evoke the same level of release.
Right.
In fact, I sort of define addiction as a progressive narrowing of the things that bring you pleasure. And I say that because it really is the way that the dopamine system works. Normally, the dopamine system is designed to be generic. It's designed to get me to do lots of things, social interactions, work, exercise, all those things. Just like the stress system is designed to get me out of bed in the morning, a cortisol pulse is what gets me out of bed in the morning. It's also what led me to pursue a career in science out of fear initially and eventually pleasure. So the dopamine system is tethered to those states of focus. And it's what Mother Nature designed so that the neuroplasticity would occur and you would want to continue those behaviors again in the future. That deer needs to know and remember and create a memory, not just of where that stream is, but the process of, when I feel that agitation, I'm going to get up and go down this particular path.
Right.
And so people think of the dopamine system as this kind of like catch-all for reward. Oh, you get likes on Instagram and it makes you feel good. That's not really how it works. And the important thing to understand is when you start getting a convergence of norepinephrine, so that level of agitation, duration path outcome, acetylcholine, and dopamine, now you're starting to wire in the behaviors that make people really good at certain things. Now, in a functional view of this, so not addiction, what this means is that for any of us, success in any endeavor is very closely related to how much focus we can bring to that endeavor. And the reward system, you start to realize, is entirely internal. No one's coming along and cramming dopamine in your ear or dripping it in your brain. It's all internal. And this starts to bring us into the kind of like discussion around mindsets. Because my colleague Carol Dweck, who popularized this theme, growth mindset, it's, again, a very misunderstood concept. It's the idea that we can change, so that's built into that. But the discovery of growth mindset was of these kids that actually really enjoyed doing problem sets that they knew they couldn't get right. But for them, they would get this like dopamine release from just focusing on the problem. They liked doing puzzles they couldn't get right. It sounds crazy, but inevitably those kids are very good at puzzles and very good at math and these kinds of things. So growth mindset is, I believe, if it's sort of a neuroscience lens on growth mindset, would be that the agitation and stress that you feel at the beginning of something and when you're trying to lean into it and you can't focus is just a recognized gate. You have to pass through that gate to get to the focus component. And then if you can reward the effort process, you really start to feel joy and low levels of excitement in the effort process. That's that buffering of adrenaline. That's that feeling like, yes, I've got a lot of adrenaline in my system, but I'm on the right path. It feels good to walk up this hill, so to speak. And when you start to bring those neural circuits together, you really start to create a whole set of circuits that are designed to be exported to any behavior you want. So if it's writing a book, great. If it's podcasting, great. If it's building a business, great. If it's building a terrific relationship, great. Then the circuits that Mother Nature has designed are incredibly generic so that we could adapt to whatever it is that we need to do. And I think the misunderstanding around how these circuits work has led to this idea that there's some secret entry point, maybe marked flow on the door, and there's a trampoline up to that door, and you just open that door and you're going to be in it.
Right.
And nothing could be further from the truth. And anyone who's done well in any career or athletic pursuit knows this, but unfortunately, there's a kind of obsession with the idea that it's all supposed to feel good. And it does feel good, but there's a whole staircase in which it feels kind of lousy.
Yeah, I mean, the feel-good aspect of that experience is very subtle. And I think, in a kind of global way, what you're talking about is falling in love with the process. Like, you have to push this gate open, which might require, more effort than you're comfortable with. But once you push through, it is about, the daily rigor and the tiny wins that you get from that, rather than, it's easy to, you set a goal, but that goal becomes very abstract, right? And it's those tiny little things that you're getting done every day that bring you that internal satisfaction that are like calibrating that plasticity. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And what's incredible is the extent to which the mind and thoughts, remember earlier we were talking about how thoughts are spontaneous? You can't control them. Negative thoughts, traumatic thoughts, bad thoughts, trying to suppress those is futile. If there's one message I can send people, it's just don't even work at that, but work at the process of introducing thoughts as almost like you would introduce actions, because we can introduce thoughts. And Carol Dweck has talked about this, that positive self-talk is not the same thing as growth mindset, because positive self-talk is almost always linked to the ultimate outcome. If I'm losing badly in something and I tell myself I'm doing great, I know that I'm lying.
Yeah,
there's no dopamine release from that. And a lot of the self-help wellness culture of the 80s and 90s was like, it's impossible to be in a bad mood if you're smiling. We wouldn't have any depression on the planet if that's true. There's probably some feedback from the face to the brain, but it's not that simple. But the idea that you can self-reward the effort process is extremely powerful, because what it means is that if you can recognize agitation, stress, and confusion as an entry point to where you eventually want to go, I do think that even just mental recognition can allow people to pass through it more easily. They think they're doing something wrong. And then rewarding yourself when you achieve any milestone, like, running to a particular location if you're trying to run a long distance, and then registering that as a partial win. What we know is that the dopamine that's released in response to that suppresses the total amount of adrenaline and gives you more room, more time, more energy to run in the running example. And this is anchored in a real scientific result. So last year there was a paper published that essentially was asking why any human or animal quits at any behavior. Now, certain behaviors, like I can't lift a car unless it's a very small car. I can't lift a car. But if we're talking about running, or we're talking about long bouts of work, the question is, why do we quit? Like, what is that? And it turns out that every time we exert effort, a certain amount of noradrenaline in the brain is released. And there's a sort of a counter in the brainstem. And at some point, enough noradrenaline is released, and it shuts down cognitive control, deliberate control over the motor circuitry, and we quit. That's it. But the thing that can restore those levels, or can sort of reset those levels lower and give us more gas, more mileage, is dopamine. And it makes perfect sense, because
and that is true, right? It's easy to understand. For example, you are trying to start a business and you keep failing. So the counter in your brainstem is going to release enough of noradrenaline for you to want to quit. And he says that it's almost like he's saying you have no control over that cognitive decision. I guess that's also something where if you see you take small milestones as a win, you're releasing dopamine, so to kind of control or push down back those levels of noradrenaline, which is very interesting. So that means, and it's something that I also introduced more, and I want to kind of also do that more, is recognize when I'm having a win, recognize when I'm doing something. For example, I used to go to the gym, but never really when I finished a gym session saying, look, Michael, you did great. You decided to push through. You were kind of tired today, but you decided to still go to the gym. Still, you finished your gym session. You did great. I think not enough people are doing this kind of self-rewarding when they hit milestones, and it can be a lot. It doesn't have to be big milestones, like, I don't know, finding a new job, getting a promotion. It's something you should do daily. Every time you decide to do something that exerts effort, you should be able to self-reward yourself. And when you do that, you kind of increase the pushback from dopamine, in terms of pushing back the levels of noradrenaline, which means that you don't get into that quitting mindset. And at the same time, since you're releasing dopamine, you're creating more energy. That's where you get this infinite energy loop. I'm going to have to stop here, but basically we're talking about the dopamine system and how it works and how extremely important it is. Tomorrow we're going to talk a bit more, maybe more about the practical things that we can do to really do all of those things that were explained in the podcast. So I hope you guys learned something, thought it was interesting. It is actually really, really important to understand how our internal systems work. And when we can do that, and we can also ultimately hack our behavior, we'll have more control over ourselves and everything we do on our surroundings. Because I feel, and that's the feeling I had for a long time, is that I didn't have really control over myself. It was almost like there was some pilot in my brain that kind of decided what I did without me having control. And it's a terrible feeling, right? You want to have as much control over yourself as possible. You want to be disciplined. You want to change. You want to have this growth mindset. And one more thing I want to do before we close out this part of the stream. Comfort zone. A lot of people say stretch your comfort zone. I say fucking obliterate your comfort zone. Actually, when you stretch your comfort zone, let's say you do it in different ways, right? You learn how to dance. You want to learn how to dance. You decide to do it. You stretch your comfort zone there. You want to learn a new language. You decide to, practice your oral skills. You're pushing your comfort zone. And the more you're going to stretch your comfort zone, the more, to me, your comfort zone overall is going to be stretched. And at some point, um, it will feel like it's obliterated, like your comfort zone almost doesn't exist anymore. And you will still have somehow, that comfort zone where, you have those routines and things that you do to really function as a human being, and to really still, you do need that comfort zone in a certain way. But you will feel extremely, it will be much easier to just start doing things and getting out of your comfort zone. And I think this is also a little bit linked to comfort zone. If you can hack your behavior, that means you can also decide when you want to push that comfort zone further and further. Okay, so thank you guys for listening, and see you tomorrow.